The October evening air in suburban Milwaukee carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of an early winter. Frank Kowalski adjusted his tie for the third time as he stood before the bathroom mirror in his ranch-style home on Maple Street, the same house he'd shared with Margaret for 47 years. At 73, his hands weren't as steady as they once were, and the simple act of knotting a tie had become an exercise in patience and determination. "You look handsome, Frank," said the framed photograph of Margaret on the dresser, though of course it was only his imagination supplying her voice. She'd been gone for 2 years now, claimed by the same type of aggressive cancer that had taken his father decades earlier. The photograph showed her at 68, just before the diagnosis, her silver hair perfectly styled and her blue eyes bright with the intelligence and humor that had first attracted him 51 years ago. Tonight was the 50th anniversary celebration for Kowalski and Associates, the architectural firm Frank had founded in 1973 with a $5,000 loan from Margaret's father, and an unshakable belief that good design could improve people's lives. The firm now occupied a sleek downtown office building, ironically one that Frank himself had designed 15 years earlier, and employed 47 architects, engineers, and support staff. Frank straightened his shoulders and examined his reflection critically. The navy suit still fit well, though it hung a bit loose after the weight loss that had followed Margaret's death. His thick white hair was combed back in the same style he'd worn for decades, and his pale blue eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, still held the sharp intelligence that had built a modest drafting service into one of Milwaukee's most respected architectural firms. The drive downtown took 35 minutes through neighborhoods Frank had helped shape over the decades. He passed the Riverside Elementary School he'd designed in 1979, its clean lines and abundant windows still looking modern and inviting. 3 blocks later, he saw the affordable housing complex he'd fought the city council to approve in 1985, 200 units that had provided decent homes for working families when other developers were only interested in luxury condominiums. Each building told a story of compromise and vision, of late nights spent refining drawings and early mornings spent on construction sites, ensuring that his designs were built according to his specifications. Frank had never been interested in creating architectural monuments to his own ego. His buildings were meant to serve people, to provide light and space and dignity to the daily routines of ordinary life. The Marriott Hotel's ballroom was already crowded when Frank arrived at 6:30. A banner reading, "Kowalski and Associates 50 Years of Excellence," stretched across the back wall, flanked by enlarged photographs of the firm's most notable projects. Frank recognized most of the faces in the crowd: current employees, former clients, city officials, and representatives from other architectural firms. The atmosphere was festive, with the buzz of conversation and the clink of glasses creating a backdrop of celebration. "Frank, there you are!" The voice belonged to David Chen, who had joined the firm as a junior architect in 1995 and was now a senior partner. At 48, David had the energy and ambition that Frank remembered from his own younger days, though he sometimes worried that David was more interested in winning awards than in serving clients. "David, good to see you." Frank accepted a glass of wine from a passing waiter and surveyed the crowd. "Nice turnout." "Over 200 people," David said proudly. "The mayor's here, and we've got representatives from most of the major developers in the city. This is really going to put us on the map for some major projects." Frank nodded, though he wondered when putting the firm on the map had become more important than doing good work. In his early years, success had been measured by satisfied clients and buildings that served their intended purpose well. Now it seemed to be measured by the size of projects and the prestige of clients. "Have you seen the display boards?" David gestured toward a series of poster-sized presentations showcasing the firm's recent projects. We really wanted to highlight how the firm has evolved and grown over the past decade. Frank walked over to examine the displays, wineglass in hand. The projects were undeniably impressive. A mixed-use development that had revitalized a declining neighborhood, a corporate headquarters that had won several design awards, a university library that balanced traditional and contemporary elements beautifully. But as he studied the presentations, Frank noticed something troubling. His name appeared nowhere on the project credits, even for buildings he had designed or significantly influenced. The Henderson office complex, completed just 3 years ago, was credited solely to David Chen and Sarah Williams, though Frank clearly remembered spending weeks refining the facade design and solving structural challenges that had stumped the younger architects. The Riverside Senior Center, which had been Frank's personal passion project, was presented as a collaborative effort by the design team, with no mention of Frank's role in securing the funding or his insistence on features that specifically served elderly residents. "Frank, you made it," Sarah Williams approached with a warm smile. At 35, she was the firm's youngest partner and its rising star, known for her innovative use of sustainable materials and her ability to navigate complex zoning regulations. Frank had mentored her personally during her first 5 years with the firm, sharing not just technical knowledge, but the philosophy of architecture as public service that had guided his own career. "Sarah, congratulations on the Morrison project," Frank said, referring to a low-income housing development that had recently broken ground. "I saw the coverage in the Journal Sentinel." "Thank you. It's been challenging, but we're really excited about the impact it's going to have." Sarah paused, seeming to realize something. "Frank, I hope you don't mind, but David asked me to handle most of the client presentations tonight. He thought it would be good for me to get more exposure with the potential clients who are here." Frank felt a slight chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "Of course, that makes sense." As the evening progressed, Frank found himself increasingly isolated at his own firm's anniversary celebration. Conversations swirled around him about current projects, future plans, and industry trends, but he was rarely included in the discussions. When clients approached him, they were polite but brief, clearly more interested in speaking with David or Sarah about ongoing work. At 7:30, dinner was served at round tables of 8. Frank found himself seated at a table near the back of the room, surrounded by junior employees and their spouses. It was a pleasant enough group, but he couldn't help noticing that David, Sarah, and the other senior staff were seated at tables near the front, close to the podium where the evening's presentations would take place. The young woman seated next to Frank introduced herself as Jennifer Morrison, a recent graduate from the University of Wisconsin who had joined the firm just 6 months earlier. "Mr. Kowalski, it's such an honor to meet you," she said earnestly. "I wrote my senior thesis on your early residential work. The Brennan House is one of my favorite buildings in the city." Frank was touched by her enthusiasm. The Brennan House, designed in 1976, had been one of his first major residential commissions, a modern home that respected its historic neighborhood while providing contemporary amenities for a young family. "Thank you, Jennifer. That's very kind of you to say. I've been hoping to work on some residential projects," she continued. "Do you think there might be opportunities for that kind of work in the firm?" Frank hesitated, unsure how to answer. The firm had moved away from residential work over the past decade, focusing instead on larger commercial and institutional projects that generated higher fees. It was a business decision that made financial sense, but it had eliminated the type of intimate personal architecture that had originally drawn Frank to the profession. "That's probably a question for David or Sarah," he said finally. "They're more involved in the day-to-day business decisions now." As dinner concluded and the formal presentations began, Frank felt his unease growing into something approaching dread. David took the podium first, delivering a polished speech about the firm's history and achievements. He spoke eloquently about the evolution of architectural practice, the importance of innovation, and the firm's commitment to sustainable design. 50 years ago, David said, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom sound system, this firm was founded on the principle that good architecture can improve people's lives. That principle continues to guide our work today as we tackle the challenges of urban development, environmental responsibility, and social equity. Frank had written almost those exact words in the firm's original mission statement, typed on a manual typewriter in the cramped office above a dry cleaner that had served as the firm's first headquarters. But David spoke as if these were insights he had developed himself, with no acknowledgement of the foundation that had been laid decades earlier. Sarah followed with a presentation on the firm's recent projects, using sophisticated graphics and 3D renderings to showcase their work. Her presentation was masterful, demonstrating both the technical excellence and social impact of the firm's recent designs. But again, Frank noticed the absence of any reference to his role in developing the firm's design philosophy or his ongoing contributions to current projects. The final presentation was given by Robert Martinez, the firm's managing partner, who focused on future plans and financial projections. He spoke about expansion opportunities, new markets, and the firm's goal of becoming a regional leader in sustainable design. It was a vision that Frank could appreciate intellectually, but it felt disconnected from the more personal mission that had originally motivated him to start the firm. As the formal presentations concluded and the evening moved into a more social phase, Frank found himself standing alone near the bar, nursing a second glass of wine and watching his colleagues network with potential clients. The conversations around him buzzed with energy and ambition, but he felt like a spectator at his own firm's celebration. "Frank, there you are." The voice belonged to Tom Henderson, a longtime client whose office complex had been featured prominently in the evening's presentations. "I was hoping to catch you before I left." "Tom, good to see you." Frank shook hands with the developer, whom he'd known for over 20 years. "I wanted to thank you personally for all your work on our projects over the years. You've always understood what we needed, even when we couldn't articulate it ourselves." The gratitude in Tom's voice was genuine, and Frank felt a moment of validation. "It's been my pleasure, Tom. Your projects have given me some of my best opportunities to explore innovative design solutions." "Well, I hope we'll continue working together. David mentioned that you're planning to stay involved with the firm for the foreseeable future." Frank paused, wondering what David had actually said about his role. "I'm here as long as I can contribute something meaningful." "That's great to hear. Your experience and perspective are invaluable." As Tom moved on to speak with other colleagues, Frank reflected on the conversation. It was clear that clients valued his contributions, even if his own partners seemed to take them for granted. The disconnect between how clients perceived his value and how the firm presented his role was becoming increasingly apparent. The evening wound down slowly, with people gradually drifting toward the exits. Frank found himself helping to stack chairs and clear tables, a task that felt familiar and grounding after the disorienting experience of being marginalized at his own celebration. Jennifer Morrison approached him as he folded the last of the tablecloths. "Mr. Kowalski, thank you for talking with me tonight. I hope I'll have the chance to learn from you during my time with the firm." "I hope so too, Jennifer. Don't let anyone tell you that residential work isn't important. Some of my most satisfying projects have been homes for individual families." As Frank drove home through the quiet streets of Milwaukee, he passed buildings that represented 5 decades of his professional life. The credit union he'd designed in 1982 still anchored a struggling neighborhood with dignity and strength. The community center, completed in 1994, continued to serve as a gathering place for local residents. The affordable housing project from 2001 had aged gracefully, its thoughtful design helping to create a genuine sense of community among its residents. These buildings would outlast him, would continue serving people long after he was forgotten. But tonight, at the celebration of his firm's 50th anniversary, it had felt as if he was already being erased from the story of their creation. Back home, Frank sat in his study, surrounded by decades of architectural drawings, awards, and photographs from project openings. Margaret's chair sat empty across from his desk, positioned where she used to read while he worked late into the evening. The silence of the house felt particularly heavy after the noise and energy of the anniversary celebration. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began writing, something he'd done throughout his career when he needed to think through complex problems. What is an architect's legacy? Is it the buildings themselves, or the recognition of their role in creating those buildings? Tonight I felt like a ghost, haunting my own firm's celebration, present but invisible, remembered by clients but forgotten by colleagues. Frank paused, his pen hovering over the paper. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new challenges, and new opportunities to create something meaningful. But tonight had crystallized a question he'd been avoiding. What was his place in the firm he'd built, and how much longer could he continue to contribute meaningfully to its work? The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, marking the end of an evening that had begun with anticipation and ended with troubling questions about his professional future. Frank closed the legal pad and turned off the desk lamp, leaving his concerns for another day. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Frank's corner office on the 14th floor of the Kowalski and Associates building, illuminating drafting tables that had been mostly cleared of active projects. The office, which he'd designed to capture the best natural light and provide views of Lake Michigan, now felt more like a museum of his past work than a center of current activity. Frank arrived at 7:30, as he had every weekday for the past 15 years since moving into this building. The habit of early arrival had served him well throughout his career, providing quiet hours for concentrated work before the office filled with the energy and interruptions of a busy day. But increasingly, those quiet hours stretched longer as his involvement in active projects diminished. The previous night's anniversary celebration lingered in his mind like an uncomfortable dream. He'd awakened several times during the night, replaying conversations and moments that had highlighted his growing irrelevance within the firm he'd founded. The enthusiastic young architect, Jennifer Morrison, had seemed more aware of his contributions than his own partners. Frank's assistant, Carol Peterson, knocked gently on his open door. At 58, Carol had worked for the firm for 12 years and had become not just an efficient assistant, but a trusted advisor who understood the subtle dynamics of office politics. "Good morning, Frank. Coffee's ready in the break room, and you have the design review meeting at 9:30. "Thank you, Carol." "What's on the agenda for the design review?" Carol consulted her tablet, scrolling through the digital files that had largely replaced the physical documents Frank was more comfortable with. The Morrison Housing Project, the new library branch for Wauwatosa, and the preliminary concepts for the Milwaukee River development. All three projects represented significant opportunities for the firm, the kind of high-profile work that Frank had once led personally. The Morrison Housing Project in particular held special significance. It was a 180-unit affordable housing development that would provide quality homes for working families, exactly the type of socially conscious work that had motivated Frank throughout his career. "And my role in these reviews?" Carol's slight hesitation told Frank everything he needed to know. David mentioned that you should feel free to offer input and guidance, but that Sarah will be presenting the primary concepts. Frank nodded, recognizing the diplomatic language that meant he was welcome to attend, but not expected to lead. It was a gradual transition that had been occurring over the past 2 years, so subtle that Frank had hardly noticed it at first. Important clients were increasingly directed to David or Sarah. Complex design problems were solved by team meetings that Frank learned about after the fact. His opinions were solicited politely, but not always implemented. The design review meeting took place in the firm's main conference room, a space Frank had designed to encourage collaboration and creativity. The long table was surrounded by 20 chairs, though only 8 were occupied this morning. David sat at the head of the table, with Sarah to his right and the project teams arranged according to their responsibilities. Frank took a seat about halfway down the table, close enough to see the presentation materials, but not in a position that suggested leadership or primary responsibility. It was a careful calibration of presence and deference that had become second nature over the past months. "Good morning, everyone," David began, consulting his tablet. "We've got 3 major reviews this morning, so let's jump right in. Sarah, why don't you start with the Morrison Housing Project?" Sarah stood and moved to the large wall-mounted display screen, activating a sophisticated presentation that showed 3D renderings, site plans, and detailed elevation drawings. The design was undeniably impressive. 4 3-story buildings arranged around a central courtyard with ground-floor community spaces and careful attention to accessibility and sustainability. "We've been working closely with the Milwaukee Housing Authority to develop a design that provides dignity and community for residents while meeting strict budget constraints," Sarah explained. "The courtyard design encourages social interaction while providing supervised play areas for children. Solar panels on the roofs will offset 30% of the building's energy consumption." Frank studied the renderings carefully, noting both the strengths and potential issues with the design. The building orientation would create uncomfortable wind patterns in the courtyard during winter months. The community room, while well-intentioned, was positioned in a way that would generate noise problems for adjacent residential units. The materials specified, while attractive, would require maintenance that the Housing Authority's limited budget might not support. "Questions or comments?" David asked, scanning the table. Frank raised his hand slightly. "Sarah, this is excellent work overall. I do have a few concerns about the operational aspects." "Of course, Frank. What are you thinking?" Frank explained his observations about the wind patterns, noise issues, and maintenance requirements. He suggested rotating the building orientation 15 degrees, relocating the community room to reduce noise conflicts, and specifying materials that would age better with minimal maintenance. The room was quiet as Frank spoke, and he could see Sarah making notes on her tablet. Her expression was attentive but guarded, and Frank sensed that his suggestions, while technically sound, were being received as criticisms rather than improvements. "Those are good points," David said when Frank finished. "Sarah, can you and your team review those issues and come back with recommendations?" "Absolutely. We'll take another look at the site orientation and material specifications." Frank noticed that Sarah didn't commit to implementing his suggestions, only to reviewing them. It was a subtle distinction that suggested his input would be considered, but not necessarily adopted. In the past, his observations would have been incorporated immediately, with team members scrambling to revise drawings and specifications. The library project presentation followed a similar pattern. Frank identified several practical issues: inadequate storage for the children's collection, poor sightlines from the circulation desk, insufficient electrical capacity for modern technology. But his suggestions were received politely and filed away for further consideration. As the meeting concluded, Frank found himself walking back to his office alongside Jennifer Morrison, who had attended the meeting as part of her training program. Mr. Kowalski, those were really insightful observations about the housing project, she said. I hadn't thought about the wind patterns or the maintenance issues. Experience teaches you to think about how buildings actually function, not just how they look in renderings, Frank replied. The prettiest design in the world is a failure if it doesn't serve its users well. Are you going to be involved in revising the design? Frank paused at his office door, considering how to answer honestly without sounding bitter. That'll be up to Sarah and her team. I'm available if they want to consult with me. The rest of the morning passed quietly, with Frank reviewing specifications for a small office renovation, the type of minor project that had gradually become his primary responsibility. It was competent work that kept him busy, but it lacked the significance and challenge of the major projects that were now handled by younger staff members. At lunch, Frank walked to a small deli 3 blocks from the office, a route that took him past several buildings he'd designed over the decades. The journey had become a daily ritual, a way of reconnecting with the physical evidence of his professional contributions. The buildings looked good, aging gracefully and continuing to serve their intended purposes. The deli was run by Maria Santos, a woman in her 50s who had inherited the business from her parents. Frank had become a regular customer over the past few years, drawn by the simple, honest food and Maria's warm personality. "The usual, Mr. Frank," Maria asked as he approached the counter. "Please, and how's your daughter doing at Marquette?" "Very well, thank you for asking. She's studying architecture, you know. She talks about maybe working for your firm someday." Frank smiled, remembering his own daughter Lisa, who lived in Denver with her husband and 2 children. Lisa was a pediatric nurse who had inherited her mother's compassion and practical intelligence, though she'd shown no interest in architecture beyond a general appreciation for her father's work. "Architecture is a good profession for someone who wants to make a positive difference in the world," Frank said, accepting his sandwich and coffee. "That's what Sophia says. She talks about designing schools and hospitals, buildings that help people." As Frank ate his lunch at a small table near the window, he reflected on the idealism that had motivated him 50 years earlier. He'd believed, with the fervor of youth, that good design could solve social problems, that architecture could create more just and beautiful communities. That idealism had been tempered by decades of budget constraints, political compromises, and client demands, but it had never completely disappeared. Back at the office, Frank found a message from David requesting a private meeting. They gathered in David's office, a space that reflected the younger man's more corporate approach to architecture practice. The walls displayed framed awards and magazine covers rather than the construction photos and client thank you letters that decorated Frank's office. "Frank, I wanted to follow up on this morning's design review," David began, settling behind his large desk. "Your input on the Morrison project was valuable, as always." "Thank you. I hope the team will consider those operational issues before finalizing the design." "Absolutely. That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you." David paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about how to best utilize your experience and expertise as the firm continues to evolve." Frank felt a familiar chill of apprehension. Conversations that began with phrases like, "best utilize your experience," rarely led to expanded responsibilities or renewed relevance. "I'm listening." "Well, as you know, the industry has changed significantly over the past decade. Clients expect faster turnaround times, more sophisticated technology, and different types of expertise than they did when you and I first started working together." David pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be organizational charts and position descriptions. I've been working with our HR consultant to develop a new structure that would allow you to focus on the aspects of practice where your experience provides the most value. Frank studied the documents, recognizing immediately what was being proposed. His title would change from founding principal to senior advisor. His direct involvement in major projects would be replaced by a consulting role on selected initiatives. His office would remain the same, but his day-to-day responsibilities would shift toward mentoring junior staff and representing the firm at industry events. "This looks like a significant change in my role," Frank said carefully. "It's really more of a recognition of how your role has naturally evolved," David replied. "You'd still be involved in important decisions, still have input on major projects. But you'd have more flexibility to focus on the strategic and mentoring aspects of practice that you're so good at." Frank understood the subtext. He was being moved aside, carefully and diplomatically, to make room for younger leadership. The proposal was generous in its financial terms and respectful in its language, but it represented a fundamental shift from participant to observer in the firm he'd built. "Can I take some time to think about this?" "Of course. There's no rush. I just wanted to start the conversation and get your initial thoughts." That evening, Frank sat in his study at home, the organizational chart spread across his desk next to a glass of the red wine Margaret had always preferred. The proposed changes were probably inevitable, he recognized. The firm needed younger leadership to compete in an increasingly fast-paced and technology-driven market. His experience, while valuable, wasn't sufficient to navigate the challenges facing architectural practice in the 21st century. But the timing felt particularly cruel, coming just one day after the anniversary celebration where his contributions had been minimized or ignored entirely. It felt less like a natural evolution and more like a systematic erasure of his role in the firm's history and future. Frank picked up his pen and began writing on a fresh sheet of legal paper. "Margaret always said that pride was my greatest strength and my greatest weakness. She was probably right. I'm proud of what I've built, proud of the buildings that will outlast me, proud of the firm that bears my name, but maybe that pride is preventing me from seeing clearly what's best for everyone involved." He paused, considering the implications of what David had proposed. The new role would provide financial security and continued involvement in the profession he loved. It would also allow him to share his knowledge with younger architects like Jennifer Morrison, passing on not just technical skills, but the values and philosophy that had guided his work. "The question," he continued writing, "is whether I can accept being a supporting player in a story I once starred in. Can I find satisfaction in influence rather than control, in guidance rather than leadership?" Outside his study window, the lights of Milwaukee twinkled in the darkness, each one representing homes and businesses housed in buildings designed by architects who had faced similar questions about legacy and succession. The city would continue to grow and change long after Frank was gone, shaped by designers who brought their own visions and values to the built environment. The phone rang, interrupting his reflections. The caller ID showed his daughter Lisa's number. "Hi, Dad. How was the anniversary celebration last night?" Frank hesitated, unsure how much to share about his complicated feelings. "It was a nice event. Good turnout, impressive presentations." "That's wonderful. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but Denver is just too far for a quick trip." "I understand, sweetheart. How are the kids?" They talked for 20 minutes about Lisa's work at the hospital, her husband's recent promotion, and the children's school activities. It was a comfortable conversation that reminded Frank of the parts of life that existed beyond architectural practice. Family, relationships, the simple satisfaction of daily routines and shared experiences. "Dad, are you okay?" Lisa asked as the conversation was winding down. "You sound a little tired." Just thinking about the future, about how things change. Change can be good, you know. Sometimes it opens up possibilities we hadn't considered. After ending the call, Frank returned to his legal pad and added one final observation. Maybe the question isn't whether I can accept a reduced role, but whether I have the wisdom to embrace it gracefully. Maybe there's dignity in stepping back when the time is right, in trusting others to carry forward the work I started. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking the end of another day in a life that was clearly entering a new phase. Frank gathered the organizational charts and headed upstairs to bed, leaving his decision for another day, but feeling slightly more at peace with the choices he would soon need to make. 3 weeks had passed since David's proposal to restructure Frank's role within the firm, and the transition had begun with the subtle efficiency that characterized all of David's management decisions. Frank's name had been quietly removed from active project files. Client meetings were scheduled without his input. The daily rhythms of architectural practice continued around him while he occupied an increasingly peripheral position. On this grey November morning, Frank sat in his office, reviewing the final details of the role transition documents that would formalize his new position as senior advisor. The financial terms were fair, the responsibilities were clearly defined, and the language was respectful. By any objective measure, it was a dignified conclusion to a distinguished career. Yet Frank felt a profound sense of loss that had nothing to do with money or titles. Carol knocked on his door, carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that Frank had learned to associate with complicated news. "Frank, I have the final materials for tonight's client appreciation dinner. David asked me to review everything with you." The client appreciation dinner was an annual tradition that Frank had started 15 years earlier as a way to thank the people and organizations who had trusted the firm with their most important projects. It had evolved from a simple dinner for 20 clients into an elaborate affair for over 100 guests, held at the Milwaukee Art Museum with catered cuisine and carefully planned presentations. Frank accepted the folder and began reviewing the materials. Seating charts, presentation scripts, award certificates for long-time clients, and a detailed timeline for the evening's events. Everything was professionally organized and carefully planned, reflecting the same attention to detail that characterized the firm's architectural work. "This looks comprehensive," Frank said, noting that his own role was limited to greeting guests and making brief introductory remarks. "David and Sarah are handling all the main presentations." "Yes, that's right. David will present the firm overview, and Sarah will showcase recent projects. There's also a special presentation planned for the Riverside Development Group. They're celebrating the completion of their downtown mixed-use project." Frank nodded, remembering the Riverside project well. He had worked closely with the development group for over 18 months, helping them navigate complex zoning issues and design challenges. The final building was one of the finest examples of contextual urban design in Milwaukee, seamlessly integrating new construction with historic buildings while providing modern amenities and sustainable features. "Who's making the presentation to Riverside?" he asked. Carol hesitated slightly. "Sarah will be handling that. She'll be presenting them with a special recognition award for their commitment to innovative urban development." Frank felt a familiar sting of disappointment. The Riverside project had been his final major client relationship, representing everything he valued about architectural practice. Complex problem-solving, collaboration with thoughtful clients, and the creation of buildings that enhanced their urban context. To have someone else present the award felt like the final erasure of his professional contributions. "I see. Well, I'm sure Sarah will do an excellent job." That afternoon, Frank left the office early to prepare for the evening's event. The drive home took him past the completed Riverside development, a 4-block complex of offices, retail spaces, and residential units that had transformed a declining area into a vibrant neighborhood hub. Frank had spent countless hours walking these streets during the design process, studying how people moved through the space and how new construction could complement existing buildings. The development had exceeded everyone's expectations, attracting quality tenants and generating the kind of pedestrian activity that makes urban neighborhoods successful. Local magazines had featured it prominently, and other cities had sent delegations to study its innovative approach to mixed-use development. It represented the best of what architecture could accomplish when design excellence was combined with social responsibility. At home, Frank selected his best suit and the tie Margaret had given him for their 40th anniversary. Navy blue with a subtle pattern that she'd said brought out his eyes. As he dressed, he found himself thinking about all the client appreciation dinners over the years, the relationships built and maintained through these annual gatherings, the sense of community that developed when architects and clients celebrated shared accomplishments. The Milwaukee Art Museum's Windhover Hall provided a spectacular setting for the dinner, with Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. Frank arrived early, as was his custom, and spent a few minutes walking through the galleries, finding inspiration in the permanent collection of American art that he'd helped install during the museum's expansion project 12 years earlier. Guests began arriving at 6 o'clock, and Frank positioned himself near the entrance to greet clients and colleagues. The familiar rhythm of handshakes and brief conversations felt comfortable and natural, reminding him of why he'd always enjoyed these events. Architecture was ultimately about relationships between buildings and their contexts, between designs and their users, between architects and the clients who trusted them with important projects. "Frank, wonderful to see you." The voice belonged to Robert Chen, a hospital administrator whose medical center had been one of Frank's most satisfying projects from the 1990s. "How are you holding up in retirement?" "I'm not quite retired yet, Bob. Still coming to the office every day, still trying to make myself useful." "Well, don't retire too soon. The industry needs people like you who understand that buildings are supposed to serve people, not just win awards." Similar conversations continued throughout the cocktail hour, with clients expressing appreciation for Frank's work and hoping he would remain available for future projects. The warmth and respect in these interactions reminded Frank of why he'd entered architecture in the first place: the satisfaction of solving complex problems and creating spaces that improved people's lives. As dinner was served, Frank found himself seated at a table with several long-time clients and their spouses. The conversation ranged from current projects to industry trends to personal updates about families and travels. It was exactly the kind of relaxed, relationship-building interaction that made these dinners valuable for both architects and clients. At 8:30, David stood to begin the formal presentations. His remarks were polished and professional, highlighting the firm's recent accomplishments and future plans. He spoke eloquently about the importance of client relationships and the firm's commitment to design excellence and social responsibility. "Tonight, we want to recognize some special partnerships that have defined our work over the past year," David continued. "These are clients who have challenged us to do our best work, who have trusted us with projects that make a real difference in our community." Frank listened as David presented awards to 3 client organizations, each recognition accompanied by a brief presentation about their projects and a beautifully crafted glass sculpture. The presentations were thoughtful and well-prepared, emphasizing the collaborative nature of successful architecture and the importance of clients who are willing to invest in quality design. "Finally," David said, We want to honor a partnership that has produced one of the most successful urban development projects in Milwaukee's recent history. The Riverside Development Group has created a mixed-use complex that demonstrates how thoughtful design can revitalize urban neighborhoods while respecting historic character. Frank straightened in his chair, expecting to hear his name mentioned in connection with the project that had occupied so much of his time and creative energy over the past 2 years. The Riverside development represented 18 months of intensive collaboration, during which Frank had worked closely with the client to solve complex design challenges and navigate political obstacles. Sarah took the podium, carrying a large glass award and a folder of presentation materials. The Riverside development represents everything we value about urban architecture, she began. It's a project that seamlessly integrates new construction with historic buildings, provides diverse housing and commercial opportunities, and creates the kind of street-level activity that makes neighborhoods successful. She continued with a detailed description of the project's innovative features, the way the building massing preserved important view corridors, the ground-floor retail spaces that activated the streetscape, the residential units that provided affordable options in a gentrifying neighborhood. Her presentation was comprehensive and technically accurate, demonstrating a thorough understanding of the project's complexities. This project required extraordinary collaboration between our design team and Riverside Development Group, Sarah continued. Their willingness to embrace innovative solutions and invest in quality materials has created a building that will serve this neighborhood for generations. Frank waited for his name to be mentioned, for some acknowledgement of his role in developing the design concepts and managing the client relationship. But as Sarah's presentation continued, it became clear that she was presenting the project as a collaborative effort by the design team, with no specific mention of individual contributions. On behalf of Kowalski and Associates, I'm pleased to present this award to the Riverside Development Group for their vision, commitment, and partnership in creating one of Milwaukee's most successful urban developments, Sarah concluded, handing the glass sculpture to Michael Riverside, the development company's president. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, and Frank joined in mechanically while processing the complete absence of his name from the presentation. 18 months of his professional life, his final major project, had been reduced to the anonymous work of the design team. The client he had cultivated, the problems he had solved, the relationships he had built, all of it attributed to collective effort rather than individual expertise. Michael Riverside stepped to the podium to accept the award, his face reflecting genuine pleasure and appreciation. Thank you so much for this recognition. The Riverside development has exceeded all our expectations, and that's due entirely to the exceptional work of your team. He paused, scanning the room until his eyes found Frank's table. I do want to specifically thank Frank Kowalski, who guided this project from initial concept through final completion. Frank's vision and problem-solving ability were instrumental in making this development successful. He understood not just the technical challenges, but the community context that made this project so important to our neighborhood. The unexpected recognition sent a wave of validation through Frank that was immediately followed by a deeper sense of irony. The client was acknowledging contributions that the architect's own firm had ignored. Michael Riverside continued for another minute, describing specific instances where Frank's expertise had made the difference between success and failure, between a good project and an exceptional one. As Michael returned to his seat, Frank felt the eyes of colleagues and clients on him. Some smiled and nodded in acknowledgement of the client's praise. Others, particularly the younger staff members, seemed surprised to learn of his significant role in a project they had assumed was primarily Sarah's work. The evening concluded with coffee and informal conversations, but Frank found himself increasingly isolated from the social interactions around him. Clients approached to congratulate him on the Riverside project, but these conversations highlighted the disconnect between how his work was perceived outside the firm and how it was valued within it. "Frank, I had no idea you were so involved in the Riverside project," said Jennifer Morrison, the young architect who had expressed admiration for his work at the anniversary celebration. "Sarah's presentation made it sound like a team effort." "It was a team effort," Frank replied diplomatically. "I just happened to be the primary client contact and design coordinator. But that's a huge role. Why wasn't that mentioned in the presentation?" Frank didn't have a good answer to her question. The omission could have been accidental, a simple oversight in preparing the presentation materials. But given the pattern of diminishing recognition he'd experienced over the past months, it felt more like a systematic effort to minimize his contributions and prepare for his transition to a purely advisory role. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Frank helped with the cleanup, stacking chairs and clearing tables as he'd done at countless events over the years. It was satisfying physical work that provided a counterpoint to the emotional complexity of the evening's presentations. David approached as Frank was folding the last of the tablecloths. "Great evening, Frank. The clients really seemed to enjoy themselves." "Yes, it was nicely organized, good turnout too. Michael Riverside certainly had nice things to say about your work on their project. You should be proud of what you accomplished there." No, the comment felt patronizing rather than congratulatory, as if David were surprised that Frank had made meaningful contributions to a current project. "It was a satisfying project to work on," Frank replied carefully. "Well, it's exactly the kind of client relationship and institutional knowledge that will be so valuable in your new advisory role. You'll be able to guide younger staff through those complex client interactions." Frank nodded politely, but he recognized the subtext. His value lay in past experience rather than current capability, in what he had done rather than what he could do. It was a subtle but fundamental shift from participant to emeritus, from active practitioner to institutional memory. The drive home took Frank through downtown Milwaukee, past buildings that represented 50 years of his professional life. The office towers and residential complexes, the schools and community centers, the hospitals and cultural institutions, all of them carried his architectural DNA, reflected his design philosophy, demonstrated his commitment to creating spaces that served human needs. But tonight, for the first time, those buildings felt more like monuments to a concluded career than evidence of ongoing relevance. The Riverside development, illuminated by carefully planned exterior lighting, looked beautiful and successful as he drove past. But it would be remembered as Sarah's project, not his, despite his central role in its creation. At home, Frank sat in his study with a glass of Margaret's favorite wine, staring at the formal documents that would complete his transition to senior advisor. The papers lay on his desk like a contract for his own professional obsolescence, carefully crafted and generously compensated, but fundamentally about moving him aside. He picked up his pen and began writing on a fresh sheet of legal paper. "Tonight I learned something about legacy and recognition that I should have understood years ago. Legacy isn't about getting credit for your work. It's about the work itself, about buildings that continue to serve people long after their architects are forgotten. The Riverside development will improve that neighborhood for decades, regardless of whether my name is associated with it." Frank paused, considering whether he truly believed what he'd written. The rational part of his mind agreed with the sentiment, but his emotional response to the evening's events suggested that recognition did matter, that being acknowledged for one's contributions was an important part of professional satisfaction. But, he continued writing, there's a difference between legacy and dignity. A person can create lasting work while being treated with respect and recognition during their lifetime. What happened tonight wasn't about legacy, it was about being erased from the story of my own career. The phone rang, interrupting his reflections. The caller ID showed Lisa's number again. "Hi, Dad. I know it's late, but I wanted to check in. How was the client dinner tonight?" Frank hesitated, unsure how much to share about his complicated feelings. "It was a nice event. Good clients, good presentations." "That's great. Are you feeling better about the changes at the firm?" "I'm adjusting to them. Change is never easy, but it's probably inevitable." "Dad, you sound sad. Is everything okay?" The concern in his daughter's voice almost undid Frank's careful composure. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just tired after a long evening." "Are you sure? You know you can talk to me about anything." Frank considered telling her about the evening's events, about the systematic erasure of his contributions and the growing sense that his professional value had expired. But Lisa had her own life, her own challenges with work and family. She didn't need to worry about her father's ego and professional disappointments. "I'm sure. Just part of getting older, I suppose. Things change, and you have to adapt." After ending the call, Frank returned to his legal pad and added one final observation. "Margaret used to say that dignity was something you claimed for yourself, not something others gave you. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for recognition and start deciding what kind of conclusion I want to write for my own career story." The grandfather clock chimed 11 times, marking the end of an evening that had clarified choices Frank had been avoiding. Tomorrow would bring new decisions about his future, about how to respond to being marginalized in the firm he had built, about whether to accept the diminished role being offered or to chart a different course entirely. Frank gathered the transition documents and headed upstairs to bed, leaving his decision for another day, but feeling more certain about what needed to happen next. The Riverside development would stand as a testament to his work, regardless of who received credit for it. But how he responded to tonight's dismissal would determine how his career concluded, with dignity or with quiet surrender to irrelevance. The December morning was crisp and clear, with fresh snow covering the streets of Milwaukee and creating the kind of winter scene that Frank had loved throughout his life in the Midwest. At 73, he still appreciated the way snow softened harsh urban edges and transformed familiar landscapes into something clean and peaceful. But today, as he drove to the office for what would be his final day at Kowalski and Associates, the beauty of the season felt distant and irrelevant. Frank had made his decision 3 days after the client appreciation dinner, sitting in his study with Margaret's photograph and a lifetime of architectural awards surrounding him. The decision hadn't come from anger or resentment, though both emotions had played a role in his thinking. Instead, it had emerged from a growing clarity about dignity and self-respect, about the difference between fading away and choosing your own ending. The letter of resignation was in his briefcase, typed on his personal letterhead, and reviewed multiple times to ensure that its tone was professional and its message was clear. He would finish the small projects currently on his desk, transition his client relationships appropriately, and conclude his 50-year career on his own terms rather than accepting the slow marginalization that David and Sarah had planned for him. Frank arrived at the office at his usual 7:30, but today the early morning quiet felt different, more like a goodbye than a beginning. Carol wasn't due until 8:30, and the building was mostly empty except for the overnight security guard and a few early-arriving junior staff members. Frank used the solitude to pack his personal belongings, a process that was both more and less complicated than he'd anticipated. 50 years of professional life had accumulated in his corner office, architectural drawings dating back to the 1970s, photographs from project openings and groundbreaking ceremonies, awards and citations from professional organizations, gifts from grateful clients, and personal mementos that marked important milestones in his career. The physical evidence of a professional lifetime filled 6 banker's boxes and left the office looking strangely impersonal. The most difficult items to pack were the photographs of projects with Margaret, taken during the years when spouses were routinely included in professional celebrations. Margaret had understood architecture's social dimensions better than most practitioners, had recognized that buildings succeeded or failed based on how well they served human needs rather than professional egos. Her perspective had shaped Frank's approach to practice, had kept him focused on service rather than self-promotion. At 8:30, Carol arrived with her usual efficiency and immediately noticed the packed boxes stacked near Frank's desk. "Frank, what's going on? Are you redecorating the office?" "Carol, could you ask David to stop by when he has a few minutes? I have something I need to discuss with him." The concern in Carol's expression suggested that she understood the significance of the packed boxes, but she simply nodded and picked up her phone to contact David. Over the 12 years they'd worked together, Carol had become skilled at reading Frank's moods and managing the complex relationships that defined architectural practice. David arrived 15 minutes later, carrying his morning coffee and wearing the slightly harried expression that had become his default demeanor as the firm's managing partner. He glanced at the packed boxes and took a seat across from Frank's desk. "What's this about, Frank? Are you doing some kind of office reorganization?" Frank handed him the resignation letter, watching David's expression change as he read the carefully crafted paragraphs that explained Frank's decision to leave the firm immediately, rather than accepting the proposed advisory role. "Frank, this is unexpected. I thought we had an agreement about the transition plan." "We had a proposal," Frank corrected gently. "I've decided to pursue a different option." David read through the letter again, his corporate training clearly struggling to process the implications of Frank's decision. The resignation was professionally written and legally sound, with appropriate notice periods and clear statements about transitioning client relationships, but it represented a significant disruption to David's carefully planned succession process. "Can we talk about this? I mean, is there something specific that's driving this decision, something we can address?" Frank had anticipated this question and had prepared his response carefully. "David, the firm you're building is different from the firm I founded, and that's probably appropriate for the current market, but it's not a firm where I can contribute meaningfully, and I'm not interested in being a figurehead or emeritus presence. That's not what we were proposing. The advisory role would have given you significant input on major decisions. With no real authority and diminishing relevance, I've watched this transition for the past year, and I understand what it means. You need younger leadership, and I need to conclude my career with dignity." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. With David alternating between efforts to persuade Frank to reconsider and attempts to understand the implications of his departure. Frank remained calm and polite, but his decision was final. He would complete his current small projects over the next 2 weeks, transfer his client files appropriately, and leave the firm he had built to continue its evolution under younger leadership. "What about the firm name?" David asked finally. "Kowalski and Associates has significant brand recognition and market value." Frank had anticipated this question as well. "The name can remain the same. I built the firm to serve clients and provide good architecture, not to serve as a monument to my ego. If the name helps the firm continue that mission, you're welcome to keep using it." As David left to consult with the firm's attorney and HR consultant, Frank continued organizing his belongings and reviewing the files that would need to be transferred. The work was methodical and strangely satisfying, providing closure to professional relationships and projects that had defined his career. Jennifer Morrison knocked on his open door at 10:30, holding a cup of coffee and looking uncertain about whether she should interrupt. "Mr. Kowalski, Carol told me you're leaving the firm. Is that true?" "I'm afraid it is, Jennifer. I'll be finishing up at the end of next week." "But why? I mean, you're the founder. This is your firm." Frank gestured for her to take a seat, recognizing an opportunity to share the kind of career wisdom that his new advisory role would have supposedly provided. "Jennifer, one of the hardest things to learn about professional life is when to step away. The firm will continue to do good work, probably better work than it would with me clinging to relevance I no longer possess. That seems impossible. You have so much experience, so much knowledge about clients and projects. Experience and knowledge are valuable, but they're not enough if they're not wanted or respected. The firm needs to evolve, and sometimes that means making room for new leadership and new ideas." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of Frank's departure. What will you do now? It was a question Frank had been considering seriously. At 73, with his health good and his mind sharp, he had potentially several productive years ahead of him. The thought of complete retirement held little appeal, but the idea of starting over professionally was both intimidating and exciting. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe some consulting work, maybe some writing about architecture and cities, maybe just some time to figure out what comes next." The rest of the morning passed with similar conversations as word of Frank's resignation spread through the office. Reactions ranged from surprise to disappointment to quiet understanding, depending on how closely individual staff members had worked with him and how aware they were of his diminishing role within the firm. Sarah stopped by just before lunch, carrying the Morrison Housing Project files and looking genuinely distressed about Frank's decision. "Frank, I hope this isn't about the anniversary dinner or the client appreciation event. I never meant to minimize your contributions to any of our projects. Sarah, this isn't about specific incidents. It's about the natural evolution of professional practice and knowing when it's time to step aside. But you have so much to offer. Your experience with clients, your understanding of urban design, we need that knowledge." Frank appreciated her sincerity, even though he recognized that her concern was probably motivated as much by practical considerations as by personal regard. His departure would create gaps in client relationships and institutional knowledge that would be difficult to fill immediately. "You'll do fine without me. You've already demonstrated that you understand the technical and social aspects of good architecture. Trust your instincts and remember that buildings are supposed to serve people, not win awards." At lunch, Frank walked his familiar route through downtown Milwaukee, visiting buildings he'd designed and neighborhoods he'd helped shape over 5 decades of practice. The walk had become a daily ritual over the past year, but today it felt more like a farewell tour than a routine inspection of his professional legacy. The Riverside development looked particularly good in the bright December sunlight, its mixed-use programming already generating the kind of street activity that made urban neighborhoods successful. Frank had spent countless hours on these blocks during the design process, studying pedestrian patterns and traffic flows, understanding how new construction could complement existing buildings rather than overwhelming them. At the small deli, where he'd become a regular customer, Maria Santos greeted him with her usual warmth and efficiency. "The usual, Mr. Frank?" "Actually, Maria, this might be my last visit for a while. I'm leaving my firm, and I probably won't be working downtown anymore." Maria's expression shifted from professional friendliness to genuine concern. "Oh no! Are you okay? Are you sick?" No, nothing like that. Just time for a change, time to try something different. Well, you'll be missed. You've been a good customer and a good neighbor. The simplicity of Maria's farewell contrasted sharply with the complex emotions and professional considerations surrounding his departure from the firm. Sometimes the most meaningful relationships were the most straightforward ones, based on daily interactions and mutual respect rather than shared ambitions or competitive pressures. Back at the office, Frank spent the afternoon reviewing client files and preparing transition documents for the projects he would be leaving behind. The work was tedious but necessary, ensuring that his departure wouldn't create problems for clients or disrupt ongoing projects. Professional responsibility required that personal decisions be implemented in ways that served client interests first. At 4 o'clock, David returned with the firm's attorney and a revised separation agreement that addressed the legal and financial implications of Frank's immediate departure. The terms were fair and professionally appropriate, providing appropriate compensation for his ownership stake and ensuring that intellectual property rights were clearly defined. "Frank, I want you to know that this isn't how I envisioned this transition," David said, as they reviewed the legal documents. "I've learned a lot from working with you over the years, and I was hoping we could continue that mentoring relationship. David, you don't need mentoring anymore. You understand the business side of practice better than I ever did, and you've built a team that can handle the technical challenges. Trust your judgment and remember why you became an architect in the first place." As the afternoon concluded and staff members began leaving for the day, Frank found himself alone in his corner office for the last time. The packed boxes sat ready for transport, leaving the space looking anonymous and impersonal. By Monday morning, someone else would be using this office, looking out at the same view of Lake Michigan, but bringing different perspectives and priorities to the practice of architecture. Frank's final task was to update his construction blog, the informal diary he'd maintained throughout his career, to document not just projects, but the evolution of architectural practice and his own professional philosophy. Tonight's entry would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of something entirely new. "Today, I submitted my resignation from the firm I founded 50 years ago. It wasn't a decision made in anger or disappointment, though both emotions played a role in my thinking. Instead, it emerged from a growing understanding of dignity and professional satisfaction, from recognizing the difference between clinging to relevance and choosing your own conclusion. Architecture is ultimately about creating spaces that serve human needs and improve communities. The buildings I've designed over the past 5 decades will continue serving those purposes long after my name is forgotten. That's the real measure of professional success, not recognition or credit, but lasting impact on the built environment." Margaret used to say that every ending was also a beginning, that transitions were opportunities to discover new purposes and directions. At 73, I'm choosing to believe that's true. The next chapter of my life is unwritten, and that feels more exciting than frightening. To the young architects who might read this, remember that buildings outlast their architects, that good design serves people rather than egos, and that the most important recognition comes from users who find their lives improved by the spaces you create. Everything else is just professional noise. Frank closed the laptop and gathered the few remaining personal items from his desk. The drive home took him past the familiar landmarks of his professional life, buildings that would stand as his legacy regardless of who received credit for their design. The city would continue to grow and change, shaped by architects who brought their own visions and values to the built environment. At home, Frank called Lisa to tell her about his decision. Her response was immediate and supportive, reflecting the practical wisdom she'd inherited from both her parents. "Dad, I think you're doing the right thing. Life's too short to spend it feeling unappreciated and marginalized. I'm not sure what comes next, but it feels good to be making the choice myself rather than having it made for me. That's the important thing. You've always taught me that dignity comes from within, from making decisions based on your own values rather than other people's expectations. Margie. That evening, Frank sat in his study with a glass of wine and Margaret's photograph, feeling more at peace than he had in months. The decision to leave the firm had been difficult, but it felt honest and necessary. He was concluding his career on his own terms, with his integrity intact and his self-respect preserved. Outside his study window, Milwaukee's lights twinkled in the winter darkness, each one representing homes and businesses housed in buildings designed by architects who understood that their work would outlast their careers. The city would continue to evolve long after Frank was gone, shaped by designers who brought their own perspectives to the eternal challenge of creating spaces that served human needs. Tomorrow would bring new questions about the future, about how to spend the potentially productive years that remained. But tonight, Frank felt the quiet satisfaction of having made a difficult decision with grace and dignity. He had walked away from professional disappointment rather than accepting it, had chosen his own ending rather than allowing others to write it for him. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking the end of a day that had concluded one chapter of Frank's life and opened the door to whatever came next. Margaret would have been proud of his decision, would have understood that sometimes the most important act of professional courage was knowing when to walk away.